Well, isn't a week a long time in politics? And I'm very lucky to have Sir Keir Starmer's former chief of staff. There's been a few, Sam White. And Sam and I have had some great chats. He came to my book launch. I was very honoured. And we were talking about how to navigate your team, the CEO's comes, how to navigate your team through turbulent times. Never more were these turbulent times. Sam, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership Podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm really delighted to be here. I feel incredibly honoured to be among some of the speakers you've had.
Well, you're very kind. And I'm very honored because you turned down various world media outlets that all want to speak to you to actually be recording this podcast today. And we're going to get it out this week because it's a very relevant one. We were saving it for a month's time, but I think relevance is important. What's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I did want to do this podcast and give it the time and attention it deserves because it's not kind of one of those fleeting, disposable conversations. It's one where you are reflecting on your hard-won experiences of leadership, what works, what doesn't work. Often it's your failures and your setbacks from which you've learned a lot. So I'm absolutely delighted to be doing this interview, Jonathan, instead of many of the other ones that are sort of pinging in my inbox at the moment. But
Who
we
was the
are
most interesting one that you were just fending off? Who is it you've turned down?
the Today program this morning, which is one of my favourites. BBC Radio 4 Today program is a flagship. Whenever I get the chance to go on it, I usually do because it's one of my favourite listens. So turning that down, was a small part of my heart died at that. But there you go.
Well, look, thank you. We are honoured. And so, look, let's have a think about this role as chief of staff. You've had a fascinating career. You've had that mix of working at a senior level in Aviva, and you've had some great mentors there. You're also doing a lot on strategy, which is your thing now, and community-based projects and doing things for children as well. So that mixture of politics, business, and charity. Few people have that, and there's often criticism of those in politics. They have no business experience. You do, and you've had various briefs within politics. And there was a lovely. I just want to read this out because as I did the research, there's this lovely quote by Sir Keir Starmer when you'd been his chief of staff. You served as chief of staff when he was leader of the opposition, and in effect helped pave the way for the later more dominant political role that Morgan McSweeney went on to occupy around Starmer and then in Downing Street. So you did it from mid 21, and you then handed over to Sue Gray. But just describe for people listening in 125 countries around the world, what are the facts of what's gone on over the last 48 hours? And what is the sort of background of your time as chief of staff and others who did it before you and after you? Give us a bit of the facts without any judging, mixing opinions with facts.
Sure. That's a big question, Jonathan. There's a lot to go out there. I think the for people listening to this outside the UK, the UK political situation at the moment is pretty volatile off the back of the Epstein scandal, which is obviously on both sides of the Atlantic is embroiling sort of royals, senior business leaders, politicians all over the place, and it seems like it's got a long way to run. I think there's been 3 million documents released already. But among these has been revealed a relationship between Peter Mandelson, who was a big player in the Labour governments and most recently had been appointed the ambassador from the UK to the US. And Peter Mandelson's relationship was known about with Jeffrey Epstein, but the Prime Minister says the degree, the depth, the ongoing nature of it was not known at the time of his appointment as ambassador. So the row at the moment is to what extent has this government made a bad judgment appointing Peter? To what extent is it, a fair risk-based assessment they made in appointing him? Versus was this just never a good idea and it reflects badly on the institutions and the vetting process? So without judgment, that is a rough summary of what's going on. And in the last sort of 12, 15 hours, Morgan McSweeney has resigned as chief of staff to the Prime Minister. Morgan has been such an important figure in the Labour Party in recent years, helping take the party back from a point where it had its worst defeat in 2019 for about 70 or 80 years. And most people at the time said it will take you a decade to turn this around. But at the time, Morgan and I and Keir and others dug in and did some difficult strategy and some difficult execution and put ourselves back into a position where we could contest an election and win it in 2024. So Morgan going is a big deal, and I for one am sorry to see him go.
Mm. And I'd just like to add in this piece that Sir Keir Starmer said after you'd been his chief of staff. So Morgan was working with you. He was chief of staff. You took over from him.
Mm.
Sue Gray came in for a period of time from government, previous government role, and then Morgan replaced her until today. Now, what is quite nice and a legacy that you leave behind is that there's two now acting chiefs of staff that actually you trained up and brought into that role. Do you want to tell us who they are?
Yeah, I mean, I won't overstate my training of them. Jill Cuthbertson and Vidya Alakeson are both very impressive people. The reason I hired both of them while I was chief of staff was because I thought they were exceptional and inspirational leaders in their own right. Um, Jill has worked for many Labour leaders, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband. There's nothing she hasn't seen. She's politically astute, and one of the great unsung heroes in the Labour Party of the last kind of 2 decades. Vidya Alakeson has been the CEO of her own organisations. Is someone with real knowledge of how to run organisations, how to get things to actually happen, and that it all too often is one of the things that's missing in politics. Very few politicians have experience of running things. Much of the civil service don't have experience of running things. They're more policy oriented. Vidya has run things. That makes a big difference. So I'm delighted that these two incredibly capable women are acting chief of staff at the moment, and we'll see what the future holds. At the time we're going to recording this, Jonathan, who knows what will have moved on by the time it goes out in a few days.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And as I say, you've had some fascinating roles yourself. And I think that's one of the roles of a leader. It's one of the key roles. My brigade commander said to me, Jonathan, my job is to find good talent,
Mm.
develop them, and then help them move on to whatever is next afterwards. Or if they're not good enough, I have to call it and fire them. And so, therefore, you finding good people who already had built their careers and a lot of experience and been a CEO of charity, things like that, is a crucial role. But it was lovely that when you finished your time as chief of staff, and you've still stayed in touch with and just discussed, you were recently with him at Chequers having a conversation the other day. So Keir Starmer said this: Sam has played an incredible role taking our operation to the next level. Under his leadership, the team has become better and stronger. He's hired some outstanding people and leaves behind a powerful legacy. And legacy is really important, as you know from the book, which you've read, Sam. Great deal of what's been achieved over the last year wouldn't have happened without him. I want to thank him for his frank advice, unstinting loyalty, and all his support to me during some challenging times. So, rather nice, isn't it, to have those words said about you?
Yeah, it is touching, and I think people like Jill and Vidya are a testament to that, hiring great people and leaving the legacy of good people in that team.
Yeah, and chief of staffs, it is a fascinating thing, and I'm doing a lot of CEOs offsites. In fact, I'm doing one tomorrow, and I'm doing one in Germany next week. And time and again, when I analyze and look at a executive team, there's some great people doing various things, darting off in different directions, driven by what they want to do. But often it's not pulled together. There's not a team glue, there's not a coordinator behind it all to make sure that, as Jack Welch, despite his dodgy dealings in fixing numbers to make it all look like it's continuous growth, so he lost his crown on that one. But some of these practices were good, such as closing the loop. So you have a meeting, a cabinet meeting, or whatever it is, or a CEO has his meeting, and he says, right, Sam, do this, Jonathan, do that. And then you come back again a month later and nothing's happened because there's no chief of staff in the background closing the loop, making sure, Jonathan, look, you were told to do this. You got a week now. Has it been done? Oh, I've been so busy. I can't have to. No, don't give me no bullshit. Just get it done because we have to move it on. And so you and I have both been chief of staff. I was chief of staff of the Army's largest brigade. And so my job was to be the chief of 75 staff, many who are older than me, more experienced, but pulling them together and not doing all the work myself.
Mm.
It's like coordinating. It's the governance of running an organization. So time and again, when we've looked at the psychometrics of a top leadership team, they're missing. It's almost like in all the different roles, there's this empty quarter where they go, oh, there's no one who does this role. Chief coordinator, team builder, change manager. I go, that's a chief of staff. Hire one. And what I was delighted about, one of the German teams I worked with, the leader, the female leader, as soon as we'd done that, within 2 months had hired a chief of staff, which has made a massive difference. And
Mm.
all these big egos rushing off and doing their own thing are now pulled together and working as a team. I don't know if that has any relevance to your experience, Sam, both in business, politics, and charity. But what do you think about the role of chief of staff?
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to hear more about your experience of doing it in a military context, because I chief of staff I think started in military roles, started to appear in senior business roles. CEO of HSBC, whatever, chief of staff running teams, and in politics. I think before in the UK, certainly before Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, the role wasn't very well known, or very few people have had that title. It now seems to have been adopted widely, and you'll find all sorts of people, relatively junior MPs with the chief of staff. So it's becoming a sort of fixture of structures, and there's all sorts of interesting chief of staff associations and chief of staff mentors. There's a woman, Poppy, who I do some work with, who helps mentor chief of staffs. Some really interesting new thing that is kind of taking its role more seriously in much more institutions. So, to your points, though, on my experience being chief of staff, I think what was really missing when I turned up in summer 2021 to run Keir's operation um, was that follow up and that sort of organization, professionalization. So, I always felt that I brought two main things. One was the sort of political strategy repositioning that we went through over that 18 months. And secondly, it was the sort of operational professionalization, i.e., can we actually execute on this? Can we actually make things happen rather than sort of spin our wheels? And for context, I had Morgan McSweeney, who'd been chief of staff in 2020, had brought me in for sort of 5-6 months to help them run strategy during COVID. And I'd got a leave of absence from Aviva, the insurance company, and gone in to do that role. I'd learned a lot, but I'd promised Aviva I'd go back at the end of that, and I did. It wasn't until another sort of 9-10 months later that the sort of Starmer project had got into real difficulty. They had a by-election in Hartlepool, which they lost against expectation. It followed immediately by a reshuffle. Didn't go very well. The deputy prime minister wouldn't move. Deputy leader wouldn't move positions. The polling was back down to sort of 10 points behind the government, even though it was a fairly unpopular government in sort of midterms, so unusually low rating. And people were saying this is over. We know now, although we didn't know at the time, Keir Starmer had to be talked out of resigning over that period. That came out in a book from one of his former deputy chief of staffs. I didn't know that, but when he contacted me in sort of summer 2021, and we had this conversation about whether I'd come back in, what would I do? What were my assumptions about what needed to happen? I did not realize how that he was ready to go, and this was his last sort of throw of the dice. And a lot of colleagues said to me at the time, "Don't do it. There's no way back from this route." Um, I thought there was, and I spent a lot of time speaking to people over that summer who had been through these sorts of transformations in the private sector and in politics. So everyone from the kind of Tony Blairs of this world through to former mentors in the private sector, CEOs I respected, people I'd worked for, and built up a picture of what we could do, an analysis of the situation and the context, with a kind of crux analysis. What would you actually need to do to turn this around? And working with people like Morgan McSweeney, who was moved to the campaign director role, Deborah Matson, who was a director of strategy. We drove a transformation over that sort of year and a half that took us from 10 points behind the Conservative Party that summer to being about 30 points ahead by the time I left at the end of 2022. And some of it, Jonathan, was a really nuts and bolts basics that you're alluding to that weren't in place. So I'm a big fan of 90-day transition plans. A great book, the sort of 90 days, which analyzes, should you, where are you? Are you in a turnaround situation? Are you in a steady as you go situation? This was clearly a turnaround situation, and in my 90-day plan, I had a number of things I thought would take less time than they did. So even in the first phase, getting people to agree what their job description was, who was responsible for what, was incredibly important. Getting actions followed up on. And what I discovered going through the previous action logs was every action either had no one attached to it or 6 people attached to it. Either way, it never got done. And Keir spent a lot of his time chasing, why hasn't that happened? Why hasn't that happened? So, you know, getting clarity over job descriptions, clarity over priorities, clarity over action owners, it's 101. But if it isn't happening, you're not going to make any progress at all. You're going to spin your wheels.
Lovely to hear, and I really relate to what you say. So, for example, with CEOs and their top teams, I teach. I don't know where I learned it from. A thing called a mnemonic called DANSAD, DANSADD. What is the decision? What is the action? What's the next step? NS. Who is accountable?
Mm.
One person. If it's a multiple,
Always
it's
one
like
person.
no one is. No one's in charge. Everyone's in charge.
Mm.
And then delivery deadline. When? Which day? On what date are you going to deliver that by? And no Dan's ad, no meeting. We're going to have an update. No, I don't want an update. I want decisions. We're bringing together highly paid people in a room for the shortest possible time to review the facts and make the decisions. Read the stuff beforehand. A lot of people say, oh, let's read through it in the meeting, or let's have a PowerPoint presentation, death by power. No, read it all before you get there, and then use the wisdom and the treasure troves of knowledge that's in the room to make a decision. And you go around, everybody has a chance to speak or pass. If they've got nothing to say, don't speak for the sake of it. Got a minute, they've got to say what it is. And then the CEO, the leader, the prime minister has to make a decision, an action, a next step, who's accountable, and a delivery deadline. And and that gets the thing moving, as you say. And you asked about military experience. I was the reason I went to the palace and got my MBE from the Queen was I pulled together as chief of staff a fictional brigade on top of my day job as running 15 Northeast Brigade. They said, we want you to create an extra brigade from part of your brigade headquarters, but also we're going to give 120 people from around the UK who've been on operations, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, peacekeeping, to go and help the Australians with the East Timor massacre that they've got to go in as the UN. They want to create a brigade headquarters, a divisional headquarters. We're sending in Americans with the brigade headquarters, the New Zealanders, the French Canadians, and they all brought brigades, and we worked together. And we, around a bird table, we had this scenario of a peacekeeping operation with terrorist attacks and all sorts of things going on, militias murdering people and raping people as they were doing in East Timor. And we really helped them work it through, but we were working as other brigades. What I learned as the chief of staff there was I had the brigade commander, the prime minister, who is ultimately the one who gets all the glory. You're the man in the shadows, and it's interesting. Both you and Morgan McSweeney, people haven't heard him speak. They don't know actually what he looks like in many of the cases. And very much with you, you're a modest person who's prepared to let the prime minister be the one who gets the glory, and it isn't about you. I had a friend who did some work in the Far East and the Middle East, and he made the fatal mistake of putting a poster with his picture up rather than the sheikh. He didn't last another day. It wasn't about him. It was all about the sheikh. And in this case, it's all about the prime minister, the brigade commander. And my job was to pull together these 120 people, all working together, coordinating them, getting them to brief on their own expertise area, but for us to run the whole show, make some decisions. And but allow the brigade commander to be the one that gets the overall picture, and you're making his life as easy as possible, and keeping the tempo going day and night. And a bit like in politics, it's day and night. It doesn't suddenly stop. There are events going on around the world which have an impact on the UK, particularly America at the moment, and whether it be Greenland or Iran or whatever it might be. And there were some moments, and I'm interested if you had this, where I remember because the 120 people weren't people I'd necessarily hired, they'd been brought in, seconded to come and work with us, and they were all stars in their own right and very ambitious. So you were managing all the egos in the room. And this one guy who was a married man decided to go off and do something which was completely unacceptable. I don't think his wife would be happy, and certainly we weren't happy. And he never came back until the early hours of the morning. And so I gripped him. He was my age, a peer of mine, and he just didn't like this and basically almost ended up punching me.
Hmm.
Luckily, I had one of the colonels who was running one of the regiments there just stepped in and said, "Look, calm this down, just back off. You know you were in the wrong," to the other guy. And he did. But, he was forever after that hated me. So you're not going to be in a popular position. You're doing stuff that people will not like, but you have to do it with integrity. And one of the things that I've liked in our conversations is we could easily become a gossip, this conversation we're going to have. You don't want to do that. You want
Right.
to tell the facts. You want to share the wisdom and experience you've had, the people you've worked for, but so that other people will benefit from that rather than it being some cheap gossip of scoring some points and being a populist, which is the tendency. But does any of what I've described in my time running the sort of chief of staff on uh, a simulation of an operation that they then went and did with the UN, and it worked very well. Uh, any of that resonate with you and the difficult people that you might have had to deal with as chief of staff?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that, Jonathan. I mean, to take your point you were making around um, the role is very specifically to stand, behind someone who is the principal and is the decision maker, the politician, the leader, whoever it is, as a sort of advisor or a chief of staff. It's not your show; it's their show, and that's very important. And I can't remember I think it's Harry Truman. I think is always said to have had this quote on a little plaque on his desk, which is, it's amazing what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit. I think that should be the formal motto of the Chief of Staff Society. Like, it's not your credit; it's someone else's achievement. But the flip side of that is, Keir Starmer this week is under a lot of pressure because of advice he took, and he is the decision maker, right? So the buck does stop with you. You are the decision maker. That is part of it. So I think a good chief of
It's
staff
in the book. It's in the book.
is it.
It's in the book.
Great.
It's amazing what you can achieve. You don't care who gets the credit. Attributed to Harry Truman from the CEO's campus. So
I have
good
had that
quote
quote
there,
on my
Sam.
desk for years. I
Good
love
quote.
that quote. If I were to have a tattoo, Jonathan, and I don't have one, I think that'd be my tattoo. I think
Yeah.
that is
And the other one,
absolutely the key to success.
by John Kabat-Zinn, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf.
Yeah,
And
that's lovely
and
too.
and Keir Starmer's got wave after wave crashing upon his beach, particularly this one over Peter Mandelson and who made the decision and who is accountable and who's responsible. And time and again, leaders are able to um, offer a religious sacrifice to the crowds to see if it would please them and if it would calm things down. But sometimes they consume the whole organization. And something like this is very large because it's about integrity. I mean, what is the I mean, I even hear people like the Polish prime minister saying that this whole thing with the Epstein guy, it could have even been a Russian honey trap to draw in so many famous people and then have photographs of them that then he could use to influence. Like we see that picture of Peter Mandelson in his Y fronts. I saw a lovely cartoon this morning drawn, and it's got this husband with his briefcase going off to work. And she said, the wife's at the door. She goes, "Darling, have you got clean underpants on?" He said, "Because I never know whether you might appear in some photographs with Epstein, and I want to make sure you got clean underpants on." But it's what are the actual facts that you've picked up, and why is it so damaging to the country and to the Labour Party what Peter Mandelson is accused of doing in the release of the Epstein files?
So, I mean, look, there's a great deal of speculation still about Epstein, as you allude to. For me, there are a number of problems here. It goes without saying, although it must be acknowledged that the victims primarily are the women and girls who were trafficked and abused by Epstein and his kind of co-conspirators, right? You know, many of whom will have had to live with the outcome of this and are now having to hear about it in the press every day. So, you know, that is the real heart of the matter. To, to your question about the kind of the politics of what's happened, um, I think the damage is partly because what Peter Mandelson appears to have done is so far beyond what anyone expected from him. Even his kind of worst enemies did not expect the behaviour to have been this bad. And let me give you an example which is kind of close to my heart. I was working for Alistair Darling as when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Brown government in 2007 2010, and it was he Alistair was probably best known for having great eyebrows, but really for having the intervention in the global financial crisis that helped prevent the collapse of some financial institutions, which would have had a knock-on effect to making electronic money basically freeze up in the UK. You go to the supermarket, you try and buy some bread, can't buy it. That was a real danger that we were facing, and then deal with the fallout of a global financial crisis of that scale into the recession, into people's houses and jobs and incomes. So it was a very turbulent time, and those who lived through it will remember it. What we did not know, and what none of us would even imagine in our wildest dreams, was that another cabinet minister sitting around that table while we were grappling with all of that was passing emails, secrets, commercial information directly to Jeffrey Epstein, who I believe at the time was already convicted. It's pretty outrageous. It's a breach of trust to the public. It's a breach of trust to your colleagues. It is a betrayal that has a knock-on effect of pushing people towards the cynical view of politics, which I think is wrong, that they're all the same. Let me say this to anyone who's listening, Jonathan, to this, who's going down that rabbit hole. They're not all the same. It does make a huge difference who's in government. Your vote does count. And Alistair Darling is a good example of this. He's someone who got to the top of politics, the second most senior job in the British government, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and was a decent man throughout. And I thought he came out of those stories rather well, where Peter Mandelson has counselled CEOs of a bank to mildly threaten, I think was the quote, mildly threaten the Chancellor. Alistair is absolutely undaunted by that. He takes these phone calls from these CEOs and he doesn't change policy. He sees it through. And I just think that is a reminder that it really, really does matter. There are a lot of decent people in politics, and please don't go down the route of saying, they're all the same, doesn't matter who we vote for, let's vote for a bunch of fascists.
Yeah, exactly. And in a world where there's post-truth populism and polarization, and the age of the strong man seems to be the way that politics is going in many countries, let's not let it slip that way. And let's talk about, while you're talking about the good ones, let's talk about Sir Alistair Darling. And what was it about him that made him such a humble but yet inspiring leader in your experience?
Yeah, I worked for Alistair Darling for 6 years when he was in Secretary of State for Transport, Trade Industry and Treasury as one of his special advisors. And you can't work for someone for that length of time, those many hours a day, sometimes in those degrees of crisis without, really seeing each other for who you are and forging a bond. And I have so much respect for the late Lord Darling. He was my boss, but he became my friend. We stayed in touch until the day he died. Um, uh, I went to his daughter's wedding. Since his death, we became very close, and in that period, I got to see some really strong leadership qualities in Alistair. And I don't want to make him a saint. He had his shortcomings too. He was not a leader with any HR skills whatsoever. About once a year, his wife Maggie Darling would phone me and say, "He thinks you're all right," and that was my entire performance review for the year. But what Alistair did do was he was very good at asking the right questions, drilling down into an issue, not being um, chivied into action, but knowing when he had to take a difficult decision. And he could do it without losing sleep, and he could do it without losing his temper. And during a period when there were many politicians who had reputations for, throwing their toys out the pram or literally throwing phones at their staff, Alistair, through some extraordinary stressful periods when the banks were, hours from collapse. Never lost his cool. I think I only pushed him to be cross with me twice in 6 years, and I kind of knew what I was doing. I was one time I was trying to encourage him to share more of his personal life. Now he was Chancellor. The public wanted to know more about him, and he was a deeply private man and did not want to. And I pushed and I pushed and I pushed to the point where he did actually snap at me. But that's what it took. The rest of the time, he was such an impressive leader. And I still hear it from civil servants today. They take me aside quietly and say, you know what, he was the best minister we ever had. And I think that speaks volumes.
And I'm smiling as I listen to that story about the wife ringing you up, something wife ringing, you're all right. The faint damned by faint praise, but um, there is that story which is apocryphal, but also I've had one or two male CEOs say to me, "Yeah, I told my wife I loved her when I married her." I said, "When did you marry her?" He said, "Oh, about 25 years ago." I said, "Have you ever said it since?" No, no, but she knows. I
It's
said,
implied. It's implied.
It's about, and this is where, just as a general tip, people actually need to get feedback,
Mm,
and feedback doesn't mean that's an excuse for just
mm,
bollocking them and just telling them they're a piece of dirt under your shoe. You actually need to, what was good, what was difficult, what should you do differently. It's called an after action review, GDD. What was good, difficult, different. And people need that feedback so they can grow and they can develop. And trying to do it by a process of osmosis and thinking, I think he thinks I'm doing a good job, but
mm,
you never
mm.
say anything, and followed up in writing, is incredibly helpful, and do it frequently. So you,
Jonathan, just on that point, I couldn't agree more. And I'm not going to pretend I always get this one right. I've thought of occasions in my life where I haven't. But one of my favorite pieces of advice on leadership is catch people getting it right. Right? Don't catch them getting it wrong. Catch them
yeah,
getting it right, and stop, pause, point it out. Commend people. Say that's right. That's exactly what we should be doing. Well done. Make a hero. More widely in the team of that action. And it's feedback can sometimes be quite difficult and painful and raw, and it's worth having 360 feedback. I think you and I both believe that strongly. But it's
yeah,
the day-to-day catching people doing it right that matters more, because the way the human brain works is you remember the bad so much more than you remember the good. You need, what is it, 4, 5, 6 times as many positive things said as to counteract the one negative thing said.
yeah.
And let me just say as well, though I think that's fundamental, I also think you need to be absolutely ruthless when it comes to removing toxic uh, people and toxic behaviors within a culture before the culture gets destroyed. So, though I love to call people out when they're getting it right, I absolutely am not going to stand for people whose behavior is preventing the rest of the organization from effectively growing or delivering.
Yeah, oh, so true. And you saw that at the book launch, where all of the panelists,
Mm,
General Lord Dannatt, Neil Basu, the number two at the Met Police, um, Mark Urban, his military career, and obviously Newsnight, and then Brian Hayworth, the CEO of Lansdowne Partners. They all said, when asked this question, they wish they'd acted earlier on toxic individuals and remove them. Because, one CEO said to me, "Jonathan, what is it you know now
mm,
about the problem you've got? And you'll find it out in 12 months' time, but you know it now."
mm, mm,
I said,
mm.
"I know that person will never get it." So,
Yeah.
okay. So, like, why are you waiting? Why are you delaying 12 months? Everybody looks at you as a leader and they go, he or she are weak. They're not acting. This person is an oxygen thief. They're not working properly for us, and he or she is not doing anything about it. And they love it when you actually act on everybody knows that person's dragging their anchor and they're not delivering, or they're toxic, or whatever it is. Everybody knows. There's no doubt about it. You can ask everybody. If there was one person, you can't really ask this question, but if there's one person who, if removed, the organization's performance would go up, who would it be? They'd probably all point at the same person. Um, that's on the darker side, but and the need for leaders to make decisions. On the positive side, I am a great believer, like you, catch people doing things right, because sometimes you get CEOs who've been CFOs or accountants, or they've been in policy jobs and then they become prime minister or whatever it is, or they're lawyers like the prime minister himself, and they're good at spotting in thousands of pages one word that's a fault, one number that's a fault. And they go, aha, I found the issue, and now I can make my case to destroy the opposition in my legal brief or in my financial presentation. Yes, but don't do that to humans. It's no good going through a human and going, of all your things, I found one fault in you. Ha ha, here it is. It just pulls people down. By all means, tackle the toxic behavior, but people are remarkably fragile and they do appreciate leaders like you and others catching them doing things right and thanking them. And the three S's. You're living in Yorkshire. I'm a Yorkshireman, born in Scarborough and brought up in Halifax and in York at school. And they say the three S's: be specific, sincere, and succinct in giving feedback. And when you and I finish this podcast, I'll end by appreciating one quality about you and ask you to, if you want, to reciprocate with one quality back. And it's a lovely way to end any call. What comes to mind for you, Sam?
It comes to mind about your many
Anything.
admirable qualities, Jonathan.
No, I don't want the appreciation. What I want is your thoughts about those two aspects of
Yeah,
dealing with toxicity and catching people doing things right.
yeah. I mean, the catching people doing things right, I think, as we said a moment ago, is absolutely crucial. I think it was a book I read called The 1 Minute Manager, which was given to me by my mum, who's always one of my great heroes. She's an exceptional individual. But it's a book I've given to so many people who've worked for me. I've run lots of teams in the corporate sector, and quite often hand out that book as a sort of, if you just read one thing on management, this is actually a
It's
very
a good
good
one.
guide.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, let's talk about management. I'm very interested. Ambition, career, origin story. Early in your career, how did you propel yourself forwards or overcome fears of not succeeding?
I'm not always sure I did actually. I think I have, at times in my life been scared to put myself into a position of, exposure and risk. But I think the the older I get, the less kind of worried I am about it. Sometimes when the worst happens, you realize actually, it's not that bad really. You can pick yourself up again. Um, I definitely had some dark periods in my life. I've had depression. I've had periods where, the time when I left Keir, as nice as those remarks were you read about me, I took a very deliberate decision to go quiet for sort of 6, 12 months and not say anything that might be detrimental. And in so doing, I left a lot of space for people to say some very unkind things about me, almost none of which were true. And you know that hurts. But when you've been through a sort of a level of public kind of kicking, actually you become pretty resilient on the far side of it and think, wow, you know, I survived that. I can survive the next thing. Um, so that was a sort of learning learning through a sort of painful phase. Um, I think I'd say to other people, the you're not going to get anywhere without some risk, um, and risk is not a bad thing. As nerdy as it is, I worked for the insurance industry for a decade, whose business model is literally buying other people's risks off them for the right amount of money, right? Like they want to acquire the right kind of risks. Risk assessed decisions is exactly how you need to live your life. I read a wonderful book by Annie Jukes, who was a professional poker player, where she said, there's only two things that ever determine the outcome in your life. It's one, the quality of your decision making, and two, luck. Kind of that's it. And you can't pretend, luck isn't part of that. So there is risk. And some of the boldest things that we did in turning around the Labour Party under Keir Starmer was when we took some risks that could easily have ended things abruptly. People won't probably remember this now, but in September 2021, Keir Starmer's leadership was under real attack from parts of the Labour Party. At the Labour conference in 2021, they tried to fire senior members of staff on the floor. There was a resignation from the shadow cabinet. There was a union that disaffiliated from the Labour Party, and Keir's speech was heckled all the way through. And there was a real moment where, you know, his existence in that role was at risk. And rather than go into that conference fighting solely on the back foot, can we just hold the ground we've got? We decided, no, we will fight on the front foot. If we've got to fight, may as well fight on the front foot. So we brought forward a series of changes to the rule book that freed MPs from a lot of the things that were pulling them to fail to look at what was in the public interest and care more about the loudest voices of the loudest activists in their local parties. We freed them from a lot of those constraints through the rulebook changes. We set out an agenda through Keir's speech that talked about, responsible government. Your money is safe with us, your security is safe with us, your concerns are our concerns, and we took the party back towards a electorally viable position where we could win an election. But there were many hours during that 3-4 day conference where it really looked like we might have bet too big and have unraveled. So, what I'm saying is do take risk in your life, but take the calculated risks. Unrewarded risk isn't worth taking, but, risks where, the downside is calculable and there's enough upside, you got to do it.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that one. And I really relate to that. Both of us have gone through periods of depression. Um, and and I think getting a public kicking. I mean, if anybody had a public kicking, it was Anthony Scaramucci. You know,
Mm.
when I had him on the podcast, and that was
I
again
listened to that one. I enjoyed the
fascinating.
mooch.
The Mooch is an awesome guy. He admitted before that, he described it as a public humiliation and chainsawing at the age of about 53. And he said, I'd been very arrogant before then. I thought I was God's gift. I'd had this meteoric career rise. And I lasted, I said, 10 days. He said, John, to be fair, it was 11 days. Come on, don't take one day away from me. I had 11 days as the president's head of comms. Um, but he said it was a very humbling experience. And my mother always said, and it's wise words, if you worry what people think about you, you'd be surprised how little they do. They're not thinking about you. They're
Mm.
thinking about themselves. And
True.
I've, in later life, read a lot of Stoic philosophy, a lot of Buddhist philosophy. And time and again, even I had my daughter, Bryony, on a call with me this morning, playing back to me non-attachment, that she was adopting that in her own role, this idea of non-attachment to what others thought of her, and therefore how she could show up in a more positive way. And time and again, when I worry about or am fearful about failing or what others think about me, I play the smaller game. But with that in mind, let's just go back to your time as Chief of Staff to Sir Keir Starmer. There was many, I'm sure, but one of the hard decisions you had to make during that time, one that kept you up at night, and what you learned from it, what would you share in your wisdom and experience?
I think one of the hardest decisions I made in that job was um, embracing a trade off that I thought was essential for us moving forward. Um, I'd worked in politics before in a Blair Brown government. I was a nice guy and people said nice things about me. I realized that going into the Labour Party in the period it was when it was falling apart, um, you know, I was not going to be able to do that without putting some noses out of joint. And I had a choice between longevity in the role and impact in the role. And I chose the impact route. And part of that was very consciously strangling the life out of two strategies that were going to lead us to defeat and ensuring we only had one strategy. Because when I went in, there were a number of problems as we've spoken about in terms of execution and professionalism, but there was also a battle between three inconsistent strategies that different parts of the operation wanted to pursue, and two of them would have resulted in total defeat again, and there was one which led to a very narrow path back. Um, but adopting that one strategy meant reducing the influence of some parts of the operation who I know have never really forgiven me for that. And um, I don't like to be disliked. None of us do. But I felt it was one of those occasions where um, I put on my armor. I did what was necessary to turn it around. When it came to the end, I chose my hill to die on, and um, I don't regret for 1 minute doing what we needed to do. I felt we were trapped in a sort of gravity well that we couldn't get enough momentum to break free of while we were trying to go in three different directions. And I thought someone has got to apply concerted thrust in a single direction to break free of the gravity and get us into orbit. And it's possible, you're one of those 1970s rockets that's never going to actually make it into orbit. You're going to sort of do 90% of thrust and then fall back to Earth. But unless someone is doing that thrust, we aren't going to get anywhere. And, we were minus 10 points behind with no coherent strategy and unprofessional when I began. We were 30 points ahead, coherent strategy, balanced budget, and kind of much more coherent, not perfect, but more coherent approach to operationalizing things when I left sort of, the end of 22. So I'm proud of that, but I'd lie to you if I was saying it wasn't extremely painful, and knowing I had to make myself unpopular with people in order to make it happen was not a barrel of laughs.
Yeah, and thank you for that raw truth, because that is what it's like as a chief of staff of an organization that's going to make a significant difference anywhere, whether it be in business or in politics, or in the charitable sector. And I think you bring out some really good points, and I'm very interested in that work you've done across government, business, and crisis management. What advice would you give to leaders who are facing navigating their team through unturbulent time? It's unprecedented at the moment,
Mm.
but as Gandhi said, you know, living your life faster and faster isn't better. You know, tomorrow is not a slower day. This is the slowest it's going to be. So this unprecedented change, this turbulence, this impermanence, as the Buddhists would talk about, the things that get used to it. It's just always going to be changing. That the government will be dealing with crisis after crisis, and businesses are dealing with crisis after crisis. But what advice would you give to the leaders listening who are facing these kind of challenges?
Um, I'm a big believer in sort of strategy plus culture. I think if you get those two things right, you can achieve incredible things. But if uh, either of them is wrong, you're not going to get very far. And I think strategy relies on a very clear-eyed, unromantic view of the facts as best you can and the assumptions explicitly, and building your analysis and action from that. But you can't action it effectively without the right culture. And if you have a culture that is metastasized, the toxic influence of individuals, it will always hold you back from your potential. So, strategy plus culture, that is how you do amazing things.
And I love that one. You know, there's that famous quote um, from the management guru: culture eats strategy
Mm.
for breakfast." This idea that, as you say, if and I see this with different European business leaders I work with, they've got so many workers' councils and procedures and protective mechanisms to save their workers' jobs, that ironically what's happening is no one's hiring more people in their country, because to hire them they then got to pay them 18 months salary if they get rid of them. So they'd rather hire them somewhere else, in India or wherever it might be. So the very thing they're doing is crippling them. And what you've said, I've seen time and again: healthy culture, get rid of the toxic elements of it and act on it quickly so you get the culture healthy. Have a clear strategy. And the Germans talk about the main effort, the secondary, and the tertiary. But you have the resources you put on the main effort to make the biggest difference, which is going to change things on you. So the strategy that's very clear, everybody knows it's on us. It's almost on a credit card. Some generals I used to know, they had their 4 points of what their strategy was on a credit card, which went in people's wallet. And the third, which is a little part of that strategy, is priorities. And
Mm.
the sage of Omaha, you know, the 525. What are your 25 top priorities? And there's always loads of priorities. Take the top five that you've got a criteria about how you're going to judge what is five, the top five,
Mm.
and don't do the other 20. Just put the resources into those top five that are going to make the biggest difference. Have you seen that work well?
I absolutely have. I love that. I mean, another great book, The One Thing. I don't know if you've read that one. Fabulous, about what is the one thing I can do to advance my main goal. Um, you know, I can't stand multiple priority lists, because what you are saying is if everything is a priority,
Mm,
nothing is a priority, and you lack strategic clarity. And most of the bad strategies I've encountered and seen is when people fail to embrace the necessary trade offs to actually break the deadlock and make something happen.
mm,
I, and I have sympathy for the government in this instance, because governing is hard, because you're sort of responsible for everything, more or less, not literally everything, but an awful lot. And as soon as you say my three priorities are education, 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 as Tony Blair once said, people say, "Oh, right, so the National Health Service doesn't matter anymore." And you go, "Oh, no, no, that still matters." So it's quite hard. I think Tony Blair in his book last year on leadership said, as Prime Minister, you could maybe have three priorities for your time in office, but any more than that, and you're just going to dilute it to the point of no impact.
I think so well said. So well said. Unseen challenge. What's something you've had to overcome or unlearn that others might not see about you, Sam, from the outside?
One thing I had to unlearn um, was, and I think you've had this challenge yourself, Jonathan, when you were a chief of staff, is thinking you have to do the thing. Um, actually, and I learned this from my boss, my first boss at Aviva, a woman called Amanda Mackenzie, who you should have on your show, Jonathan. She is an inspirational leader of the highest order. She went on to be CEO of Business in the Community and the Queen's Library and things like that. But when I worked for her, in my first month or two, she pulled me into her office and said, "Sam, you now got the title director in your job description, which means you need to do an awful lot less doing and a little bit more directing." And it was just perfect timing, perfectly succinct. And here we are 15 plus years later, and I'm sort of still carrying it in my head. And I think that is where I got better at being a leader, is when I followed her lead in hiring the best people you can whenever you can make hires, people who know more about the subject they are responsible for than you do, and letting them get on with it, giving them decisive decision making when they need it, but a lot of the time posing back the coaching question, well, what do you think? What more could you do? What's the reason this isn't actually working? You know, so much that I learned from Amanda, and I've been part of many teams in politics, in governments, in business, in charity, but that's still one of the most powerful teams I was part of. Along Nigel Prideaux, Jan Gooding were part of this team, and the four of us still go out for dinner every 6 months, even though we stopped working together best part of a decade ago, because she hired people who she then trusted, and they were there to support each other, but never tread on each other's toes or land grab or anything like that. And she herself modeled just such wonderful leadership. So what I've had to unlearn is the doing part of things. And in fact, I don't think I could have done the chief of staff job if I'd been trying to do everything. I was very, very um, self controlled about not getting involved in too many things. In fact, on my job description, which I cleared with Keir, here are my 7 things. Seven's a lot, but parts of the role. Um, and at the bottom, I had and here's things I'm definitely not going to do. And so things like Prime Minister's questions, highly visible part of the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister's week. A lot of people watch it. It's a big moment. I thought to myself, there is no way I can do the difficult, strategic, moving the dial stuff on the stuff in the urgent and important box on that 2x2 grid if I'm scurrying around to spend, 8 hours a week prepping for PMQs. So I found a team who were capable of doing that, delegated it to them, and barely troubled them, except for maybe one or two occasions in 18 months where I said, "Oh, have we thought about this question?" But other than that, let them get on with it.
That's real great wisdom. And I always encourage CEOs, as well as their to-do list, and which really it's the top three that they're going to be famous for or make an impact in the organization or touch the lives of the most people. But they also, before they do that, they needed to stop doing list.
Mm-hmm.
Because I put on my list, which is just attached to my computer here, my top priorities. My wife is number one, unconditionally love and support her. Two is being here now, being in the moment with you. Three, health. Four, family. Five is the CEO's Compass book, helping to coach and develop teams. Six, podcasts. Seven, experiences, having fun. And seven is the charity, giving back, and the Ride to Inspire, which you're going to be involved in some way, form or other, because philanthropy and giving back to people who've been through abuse and mental health issues is big on your agenda too. But the reason I say that, at the bottom it says shed 80% of what I do every year.
Mm.
And I think the biggest benefit is to create the mental strategic time and space as a senior leader to think about what really matters rather than busy, dead. And too many
I couldn't
people
agree
have
more.
rushed through their lives and they never create that walking time with a colleague to talk things through, strategic thinking time, so that they're not to stop doing list. Before we go into your top tip and your introduction of yourself at the end, there's these acting chief of staff, Jill Vidya, who you hired. Clearly, they're going to do their own thing. But in your time as a chief of staff, if there were three things that you've seen work well, that you would wish well for them, what would be what you've seen stand the test of time as good principles by which they navigate their team through these turbulent times?
So, with a chief of staff specific lens on that
Mm-hmm.
question,
Mm-hmm.
I would say the first thing is speak truth to power. Um, when I went to work for Keir, the second time I went to work for him, when I was his chief of staff, we had our first meeting in that new capacity in the House of Commons, and I went through my list of here are the seven parts of this role as I see them. He stopped me on number five and said, that's the most important one. Be the person who tells me the truth I don't want to hear, especially when no one else is telling me it. You know, that's your job above all else. And that is very important, and it doesn't make you popular. If you do it too much, you know, your boss almost gets a Pavlovian response to seeing you as, oh God, here comes Sam with an unpalatable truth. But it's so important because, you know, leaders who get disconnected from what the real problem is are not making good decisions. So do that part of it. Secondly, I'd say, you know, get some good advisors of your own, a good, you know, personal board of people who you can talk to and trust. I was very fortunate when I did the job. I sought out Jonathan Powell, who'd been chief of staff to Tony Blair very successfully for over a decade. And he was kind enough to mentor me through much of that process. But I also had a great guy who had been a special advisor in the Blair Brown government and then had moved across to becoming a professional careers coach. And he voluntarily gave up, you know, time which he could often charge to a CEO at, you know, at four figures an hour, to mentor and coach me through difficult decisions I had when I was in the chief of staff role. So shout out to Jim Godfrey for all his time. Find people like that who you can speak to. And Amanda McKenzie, who I mentioned before, you know, we would sit and have coffee long after she stopped being my boss, where I try and unpick this stuff, and, you know, gave me great advice, particularly advice on things like culture. Third, I guess I go back to that. You can't do everything. You you need to think carefully about where you can add value and where you can get out of the way and let other people have their moments. For example, a lot of people found their power by always being on the trip with the principal, with the chief staff, with the prime minister or leader of the opposition. Sit on a train with him, you know, for 8 hours while he goes up to Scotland. You can't really have much of a conversation on the train anyway without being eavesdropped. But people felt the proximity was a source of power. I always eschewed that. I said, no, that time is better spent doing the difficult, unsexy, strategic work that moves forward the project, and I will forego a bit of the face time and power to do that. I would recommend that to them as chief of staffs. Be very careful about how you use your time. Be very clear what the stuff in the important box, not the urgent box. That's where you want to be.
Wise words. So now is the time for you to say who you are, what you're doing now, what you've done before, and what your top practical leadership tip is, Sam. So over to you.
My name's Sam White. I have worked half my life in politics and government and half in the private sector. I'm probably best known for being Keir Starmer's chief of staff in opposition for the turnaround phase of the Labour Party. I currently am priority one, dad to my kids while my wife's career is on fire. But because they're of school age, it allows me to do some things that excite me. I'm the chair of Foundations, which is the What Works Centre for Children and Families. Its role is not just saying what sounds good in terms of intervention affecting vulnerable children, but what in practice actually delivers. Doing evidence-based policy making based on randomized control trials and other methodologies. So doing some fabulous work to help people in need, especially children in care, children suffering domestic abuse. I also advise company CEOs in a range of areas. I do a little bit of media and have the opportunity to come on fabulous podcasts like Jonathan's.
And your top tip to chief of staffs in business around the world, what top tip would you give them?
Um, this isn't the nicey end of leadership, but I know you believe this too, Jonathan. It's that you need to hire on culture as well as competence. On attitude. When I hired Vidya and Jill as chief of, who are now the acting chief of staff, both of them were competent, but also culturally uh, benign. Good attitude, going to make the situation better, not worse. And the flip side of that is you need to be ruthless in removing people from the operation who are toxic. Doesn't matter if they're stars or poor performers, not relevant. If they are culturally toxic and show no interest in change, they need to go, because otherwise the whole organization can get metastasized and marinate in a poor culture that affects everyone.
Wise words. Sam White, thank you for your service to country, to the current Prime Minister, and also to just your experience that you've had in life. And thank you for sharing something which is a very salient topic right now, which is why we're going to have a special edition of this podcast and share your insights. Thank you for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.